At exactly 7:43 on a Tuesday night, a 22-year-old waitress named Sarah Bloom threw herself in front of a bullet meant for a woman she had known for exactly 11 minutes. She didn't think about it. That's the part people always get wrong when they imagine heroism. They think it's a decision. They think someone stands there, weighs the options, measures the risk, and then chooses to be brave. But Sarah Bloom didn't choose anything. Her body moved before her brain had finished processing the sound of the door swinging open. Before she registered the men in dark coats. Before she understood what the flash of metal in the overhead light actually meant. Her body just went. And that's how everything changed. Harlow's was the kind of restaurant that didn't need to advertise. It sat on the corner of Beckett and Vine in the old part of the city, tucked between a jeweler that had been there since the 1940s and a parking garage nobody used anymore. The sign out front was small, brass, and said nothing except the name. No hours, no menu in the window, no Yelp sticker. If you had to look it up, you weren't the kind of person they were expecting. Sarah had worked there for 14 months. She'd gotten the job through her cousin, who waitressed on weekends, and she'd kept it because she was good at it. Not just at carrying plates and remembering orders, but at the specific invisible art of reading a room. She knew when a table wanted to be left alone. She knew when someone needed their glass refilled before they had to ask. She knew without being told which guests were regulars and which ones were first-timers, pretending not to be intimidated by the wine list. She did not know, until that night, who most of the regulars actually were. Table 12 was reserved every Tuesday. Same time, 7:30. Same order, the branzino, roasted root vegetables, a bottle of the Barolo they kept in the back specifically for this table, never sold to anyone else. The reservation was listed under the name Fiorenza. Just the one name, no last name, the way the really old money tables sometimes did it. Fiorenza turned out to be a woman of 78 years, with white hair pinned so precisely it might have been sculpted, a string of pearls that Sarah suspected cost more than her car, and the kind of posture that made you sit up straighter just by being in the same room. She arrived with two men who stood near the door, rather than sitting. Not bodyguards exactly, or at least not obviously, because one of them was scrolling his phone the moment they arrived, and the other had stepped half outside to light a cigarette before the old woman had even settled into her chair. Fiorenza didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she had long since stopped expecting more. She ordered without looking at the menu. She asked Sarah, with genuine interest, whether the branzino was fresh today, and when Sarah said she'd personally seen it come in that morning, the old woman smiled, a real smile, not the performative kind, and said, "Good girl. I like someone who pays attention." It was a small thing. It was nothing, really. But Sarah remembered it afterward, when she was trying to understand why she'd moved. Maybe it wasn't just instinct. Maybe some part of her had already decided, in that 11-minute window, that this woman was worth paying attention to. The restaurant was full but not loud. Soft conversation, silverware, the low jazz that the manager insisted on, even though Sarah privately felt it was a little much. She was coming out of the kitchen with the Barolo when she noticed the front door. Two men came in together. Dark coats, wrong fit, too stiff across the shoulders, which meant something underneath. They didn't pause at the host stand. They didn't look around the way first-timers do, taking in the room. They looked directly at table 12. Sarah was halfway across the floor. Later, she would remember that her first coherent thought was not gun or danger or even run. It was, where is she looking? Because Fiorenza was looking at the bread basket, reaching for it with one hand, entirely unaware. The rest happened in the space between one breath and the next. The taller of the two men raised his arm. Sarah was between tables 11 and 12. She covered the distance without understanding she was covering it, and then she was in front of the old woman, arms out, body angled, a human wall between Fiorenza and whatever was coming. The first shot caught her in the left shoulder. The second hit her side. She didn't fall right away. That surprised her, later, in the hospital. She'd always imagined. In the vague, hypothetical way you imagine things you don't expect to ever happen, that a bullet would knock you down immediately. Instead, she stayed on her feet for 3, maybe 4 seconds, which felt much longer than it was, and she remembers looking down at the white of her uniform shirt and thinking, with strange calm, "That's going to stain." Then her knees went. The floor of Harlow's was cold marble, black and white, and it came up to meet her fast. She was aware, in pieces, of the chaos after. Screaming she didn't participate in, running. The sound of a third shot and then something heavy falling. One of the men in dark coats, she learned later, taken down by a security detail that materialized from somewhere she hadn't known to look. More shouting, glass breaking, and then, cutting through all of it, a voice. Not loud. That was the strange thing. It wasn't shouting the way everyone else was shouting. It was low and controlled, and somehow that made it carry further than anything else in the room. "Move! Everyone move now!" The crowd parted, and Sarah, lying on the cold marble with her cheek pressed against the floor, tilted her head to look. The man who crouched down beside her was not one of the men she'd seen come in. He was wearing a dark suit, and he moved with the kind of economy that suggested he had been in rooms like this before, rooms that had suddenly stopped being safe, and he had not panicked in any of them. He pressed one hand against her side, where the pain was bright and specific and getting louder by the second, and he looked at her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not frightened, not cold either, something in between. "Stay with me," he said. He wasn't asking. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah told him, which struck her as a strange thing to say under the circumstances, but was, she supposed, accurate. She heard the old woman's voice from somewhere above and behind her. Fiorenza, still at the table because of she was, because Sarah had registered somewhere in the last 2 minutes that this woman did not rattle easily. Dante. Just that. One word. And the man beside Sarah, Dante, looked up at his mother, and something in his face shifted. "I see her," he said. Dante Moreau was 41 years old and had spent the last 19 of those years in the business of being feared. He ran a network that stretched across 4 cities and 2 countries. He had brokered deals that no government official would ever sign their name to, and resolved disputes that no court would ever hear. He was not, by most measures, a man who was moved easily. He had arrived at Harlow's 20 minutes late because of a meeting that had run long, and he'd been irritated about it. Not at his mother, never at his mother, but at the general principle of being behind schedule. He'd seen the commotion from the street before he got to the door. He'd heard the shot. He'd moved through the restaurant in 4 seconds and found his mother standing behind a girl. He didn't recognize who was bleeding onto the floor of his mother's favorite restaurant. The girl was still conscious, which surprised him. Most people go somewhere far away when they're hit, but her eyes were open and she was looking at him like she was still present, still here, in the room, in the situation, and she said something that almost made him laugh despite everything. She said, "Is she okay?" Not "am I okay?" Not "help me." The first words out of her mouth were about the woman she'd just taken 2 bullets for. He looked at her for a moment longer than the situation strictly required. "She's fine," he said. "You're not." "I know," Sarah said, and closed her eyes. His mother rode in the ambulance. That was the detail that everyone on the medical team remembered. Afterward, that an old woman in pearls refused to leave the ambulance bay, refused to be directed to the waiting room, and sat beside the gurney the entire way with one hand wrapped around the girl's wrist, pressing hard like she could hold her together by will alone. Fiorenza Moreau was not, as a general rule, a woman who did things without reason. She had lived 78 years in proximity to a world that required you to understand at all times what things cost and what they were worth. She had measured people her entire life, assessed them the way a jeweler assesses a stone, looking for the flaws, the fractures, the places where they'd break under pressure. In 11 minutes at Harlow's, she had decided that Sarah Bloom did not break. In the ambulance, she made another decision. She did not share it yet. She simply held the girl's wrist and watched the city blur past the small windows and said nothing at all. The surgery took 4 hours. Dante waited outside the operating room for the full 4 hours and did not sit down once. His head of security, a man named Orrin Webb, stationed himself nearby and had the good sense not to speak unless spoken to. 2 of his other men were at the hospital entrance. The rest were handling the aftermath at Harlow's. The bodies, the witnesses, the particular logistical problem of making sure that what had happened was understood in the necessary quarters as a declaration of war, because it was. Someone had sent men to kill Fiorenza Moreau. His mother. Not him, not the organization, not the business, not any of the usual targets. His mother at her Tuesday table, reaching for bread. That required a response he was already formulating, precise and complete, but that was a problem for later. Right now there was a girl in surgery who had covered his mother's body with her own before his own men. He noted this, grimly, filed it away for a separate reckoning, had even registered the threat. He thought about the guard who'd been on his phone when the door opened. He thought about the one who'd stepped outside for a cigarette. He would think about them both at length later, in a different kind of room. But right now he thought about the girl. He did not know her name for the first hour. It was his mother who told him when Fiorenza emerged from wherever she'd been sitting and appeared at his elbow with a cup of coffee she handed to him without comment. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Bloom. She's been working at Harlow's for just over a year. She's 22. She lives alone." A pause. "She asked me if the branzino was fresh before she brought it out. I liked that." Dante looked at his mother. "You want to tell me something," he said. "I want to tell you several things," Fiorenza said pleasantly. "I'll start with the most important. That girl is alive because she chose to be, and we are going to honor that accordingly." She said it simply, without drama, in the same tone she used to give directions to her housekeeper or discuss the weather. But Dante had known his mother for 41 years, and he knew what that tone underneath the pleasantness meant. It was not a suggestion. Sarah woke up to white ceiling tiles and the specific smell of a hospital room that had good equipment, not the antiseptic over-industrial cleaner smell of the places she'd been to before, but something cleaner, quieter. She blinked. Her left shoulder felt far away, which she understood meant she was on good medication. Her side felt less far away, which meant the medication had limits. There was a woman sitting in the chair beside her, old white hair, pearls, looking at Sarah with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something adjacent to one, warm, certain assessing. "You're awake," Fiorenza said. "Where am I?" "Sambro's private wing." A small pause. "I may have made some calls." Sarah processed this. "I got shot," she said. "Twice. You'll have some recovery ahead of you, but the surgeons are very good. We've used this hospital before." She said it without elaboration. "The way you say we've used this mechanic before, practical and certain. The restaurant is being handled. The people who came in, also being handled." Sarah looked at her for a moment. Are you safe?" Fiorenza's expression did that thing again, the thing that wasn't quite a smile. "Yes, my dear, because of you." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She stared at the ceiling for a moment and tried to find something practical. "I don't have insurance that covers. I'm going to need to figure out." "You won't," Fiorenza said, with a finality so complete it didn't invite argument. "That has been handled as well." The door opened. Dante filled the doorframe the way large. Certain men do. Not aggressively, but in a way that changed the dimensions of the room slightly. He looked at Sarah, and she looked at him, and she remembered him from the floor of the restaurant, the pressure of his hand on her side, the command in his voice. "Stay with me." She had. "She's awake," his mother told him unnecessarily. "I see that." He came in and stood at the foot of the bed, not close, not far. He looked at Sarah with that same unreadable expression from before, and then he said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "Why did you?" She thought about it honestly. "She wasn't looking," Sarah said. "She was reaching for bread and she wasn't looking, and I was the only one close enough." He was quiet for a moment. "My men should have been close enough," he said. "They weren't." He nodded. One small, precise nod, like he was confirming something he'd already confirmed to himself. "No," he said. "They weren't." She was in the hospital for 9 days. Fiorenza came every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for most of the afternoon, bringing things. A better blanket, books she thought Sarah might like. Once a container of soup from a kitchen that was clearly not a hospital kitchen. She never announced these visits and she never asked permission. She simply appeared, settled into the chair like she'd always sat there, and stayed until she was satisfied. On the 4th day she said, "My son would like to speak with you about arrangements." Sarah looked up from the book she'd been trying to read. "What arrangements for your safety?" A pause, delicate and deliberate, "and for other matters." "I don't." Sarah stopped. She was aware she didn't fully understand the landscape she'd been dropped into. She'd done 14 months at Harlow's without fully understanding who she was serving, which she now recognized as a significant gap in her awareness. What kind of other matters? Fiorenza looked at her with those direct measuring eyes. You are in an unusual position, Sarah Bloom. You entered our world through an act of grace, rather than ambition or accident. That is rare. It means something, where we come from. I don't come from anywhere, Sarah said carefully. You come from exactly where you are, the old woman said, standing in front of someone who needed standing in front of. That's not nothing. In our world, it's rather a great deal. The conversation with Dante happened on the 7th day, in the same room, with the evening light coming through the blinds at a low angle and laying stripes across the floor. He sat in the chair his mother usually occupied and did not make it look any smaller. He did not open with small talk. She appreciated that. You're being discharged in 2 days, he said. Your apartment is not safe to return to. Sarah opened her mouth. He continued before she could. That's not a threat. I want to be clear about that. It's a practical statement. The people who came into Harlow's were looking for leverage. You have become, inadvertently, someone of significance to my family. They will know that by now, if they've done any research at all, and they'll look for you. Why would I be leverage? He looked at her steadily. Because my mother has made clear what you mean to her, and what means something to her means something to me. Sarah said nothing for a moment. There was something very precise about the way he spoke, not cold, but controlled, the way something is controlled when it is also, underneath, not entirely controlled. What are you offering? She asked. A residence that is secure, protection, whatever you need in terms of your personal situation, your income, your family, anything that requires managing. A pause. And my word that you will be safe, in exchange for what? He looked at her. Nothing, he said. There is no exchange. You gave something without asking for anything. That's not a transaction I put a price on. She studied him for a long moment. He let her. Why are you telling me all this yourself? She asked. You could have sent someone. I could have, he said. He didn't explain why he hadn't. He didn't have to. She moved into the Moreau property on a Thursday under gray November skies that suited the occasion. Tentative, neither one thing nor another. The house was not what she had imagined, which was a fortress. It was large and old and set back from a quiet street, with trees that had lost most of their leaves and a garden that looked like it had been exceptional in warmer months. There was a housekeeper named Bet who showed Sarah to a room that overlooked the garden and asked, without ceremony, whether she had any dietary restrictions. Fiorenza took her on a brief tour that evening, moving through her own home with the ease of someone who had lived in it long enough that the rooms were extensions of herself. She showed Sarah the library, the kitchen, the smaller sitting room that got the morning sun. You'll have freedom here, she said. As they stood in a hallway hung with photographs, Sarah was careful not to look at too closely. This is not a cage. I want you to understand that. I know, Sarah said, and found that she meant it. Good. A small nod. Because cages breed resentment, and resentment is corrosive, and I have lived long enough to want none of it anywhere near me. Sarah smiled, and Fiorenza saw it, and something in the old woman's expression softened by a degree. You'll be all right, she said. It was not a platitude. It sounded like something she'd examined carefully and concluded was true. The weeks that followed were strange in the way of all transitions, neither fully one thing nor the other. Sarah recovered. She walked the garden in the mornings when her shoulder allowed it. She read books from the library. She learned the rhythms of the house. When Fiorenza took her tea, when Dante arrived for dinner, which happened 3 or 4 times a week with the punctuality of a ritual. She learned that Dante was not what she had assumed, and also not entirely different from what she had assumed. She had expected someone closed, armored, operating at a distance from everything human. Instead, she found someone who was precise where others were careless, quiet where others performed loudness, and who asked questions with the genuine intention of actually hearing the answers. He asked about her family. She had parents in another state, a younger sister she called on Sundays, no other significant entanglements. He asked about the job at Harlow's, how she'd gotten it, whether she'd enjoyed it. I liked it, she said honestly. I was good at it. You were, he said. Oren spoke to the manager, several of the staff. You apparently had an instinct for the room, for reading people, she said. That's valuable, he said, in the tone of someone who had spent a great deal of his life depending on exactly that. She looked at him. Is that what this is about? He met her eyes. No, he said simply. That's not what this is about. On a Sunday in December, Fiorenza found her in the library and sat across from her and did not pretend to be picking up a book. My son, she began, with the directness Sarah had come to recognize as her baseline, is not a man who makes things easy for himself. He has been in this life since he was very young, and he has learned, as people do in this life, to be careful. About everything, about everyone. She folded her hands in her lap. He is not careful about you. Sarah looked at the old woman carefully. Mrs. Moreau, Fiorenza. She tried to order her thoughts. I don't know what I am here, exactly. I'm grateful and I like. She stopped. I don't know what the rules are. There are no rules, Fiorenza said, as if this were obvious. There is only what is true and what isn't. She tilted her head. My son has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you since he was young enough to still believe the world was navigable. I am not telling you what to do with that. I am telling you that I have seen it. Sarah was quiet for a moment. What do you want for him? She asked. Not for me. What do you want for him? The old woman's expression, and Sarah would think about this moment later, turning it over, became something she hadn't seen on Fiorenza before. Not the warmth, not the assessment, not the authority. Something older and simpler. What every mother wants, she said. Someone who is there when I'm not. She found him in the small sitting room that evening, the one that got the morning sun but held it in the evenings too, reflecting off the windows across the garden. He was sitting with a glass of something he wasn't drinking, looking at nothing in particular. And when she came in, he looked up and something in him settled. That was the only way she could think to describe it, in the way of something that has been held at a particular tension and is finally allowed to ease. She sat down across from him. Your mother talked to me today, she said. I know, he said. She told me she was going to. You know everything she does. Not everything, he said, but most things. A pause. She loves you, for what it's worth, which is considerably more than most things. Sarah looked at him. And you? He was quiet for a long moment. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't know the answer, but the quiet of someone choosing whether to give it. Then, you threw yourself in front of a bullet for my mother, he said, without knowing who she was, without knowing who I am, without any reason in the world, except that she wasn't looking, and you were close enough. He looked at her steadily. I have spent 19 years in rooms full of people who calculate everything, every word, every gesture, every risk. I have never once seen anyone do something so entirely uncalculated. It wasn't brave, she said. I didn't think about it. I know, he said. That's the thing. She understood then. For him, a man who lived in a world where everyone had an angle, everyone had a reason, everyone wanted something. The most astonishing thing she could possibly have been was someone who simply moved. No calculation, no trade, no margin. Just, she wasn't looking, and I was close enough. He reached across and put his hand over hers, and it was the same hand that had pressed against her side on the marble floor of Harlow's, holding the damage at bay, and she thought, this is what he is, underneath the stillness and the control. Someone who holds things together. Someone who stays. I'm not easy, he said quietly. I want you to know that. This life, this world, it is not easy. I won't tell you otherwise. I know, she said. And you're still here. I'm still here, she said. Outside, the garden was dark, and the last of the November trees were bare against the sky, and inside the small sitting room the light was warm and ordinary, and he did not let go of her hand. They married in the spring, in the garden that had been exceptional in warmer months and proved it. Fiorenza wore a different string of pearls, longer, ivory, a gift from her late husband the year they were married, and she sat in the front row and did not cry, because she was not. She had explained to Sarah privately, a woman who cried at weddings. She cried at weddings. Sarah saw it from 20 feet away and loved her for it fiercely. The ceremony was small, the way all things in this world were small when they were real. No audience, no performance, no gesture toward the city beyond the garden walls. Just the people who mattered, and the kind of vows that don't need to be ornate, because they're made by people who understand the weight of them. Dante looked at her when she came through the garden gate, and his expression was the same expression he'd worn in the hospital, in the sitting room, in every quiet moment between then and now, the one she'd finally learned to read after all those months of watching him carefully. It was the look of someone who has stopped calculating, someone who has put down the arithmetic of risk and benefit, and simply, fully arrived at a place they intend to stay. He had made her safe. She had made him without meaning to, human again, or more human, more present, more willing to let something matter. And Fiorenza Moreau, 78 years old, who had grown up understanding what things cost and what they were worth, sat in the front row of her own garden and wept, quietly, for the sheer good fortune of being alive to see it. Because a girl she had known for 11 minutes had reached for her wrist on the floor of a marble restaurant and held on, and because of that, because of one uncalculated, instant, selfless act, the whole of what came after had been possible. What do you think? Was Sarah right to trust him? And was Dante's world ever something a woman like Sarah could truly be safe in? Or is that the question that keeps you up at night too? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love stories like this one, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because Rosie's Romance Library is just getting started, and we have so many more stories waiting for you.